This is drive time. Hope you can hear my car just as loud as ever. And thought I'd come on today and just talk about where I'm at right now as I've studied the law and studied the Hebrew roots movement, their arguments for keeping the law as they do. And not claiming I don't have, more things to learn, always, but as I've dug into it more and more and more, I have come to some conclusions, and that's really what I want to talk about in this little talk. So we'll see if I get all the way through it before I get home, but here we go. So, to start out, I want to say just what I believe that the law is, and also that there are, and the law, as if there's only one law, is actually, I think, not quite accurate to what Scripture teaches, and we'll get into that a little bit. But at least as we look at the whole of Scripture, that's something we see. So, what is the law? Well, again, as I just said, I don't think there's only one. So let's talk about different ways that term is used in Scripture to help us understand. And I want to say at the outset, I believe in God's law, and I believe that we are obligated to obey God's law. The question has never been for me to, whether to obey or disregard God's law. That's never been the question. The question has always been, how does God expect us to obey His law? And when I'm using that phrase, God's law, or if I were to say the law of God, I am, it should be pretty obvious from all the other content I've created that I'm not using that phrase the way that the Hebrew roots person is using it. And I contend that I'm using it biblically, and they're not using it biblically. That they are flattening out where God is, where the distinctions are present in Scripture, they're ignoring those distinctions. And then at times when it serves them, they're creating distinctions where no distinctions exist in the text in order to get out of certain things, especially in Paul's writings. So when I talk about God's law, I am talking about, at least here at the start, I'm talking about what I believe we're all supposed to be obeying. We are supposed to obey God's law. The question is whether the law that was given to Moses on Mount Sinai, and within the Exodus story, I should say. I mean, some of it is given in, as a precursor. The Passover is talked about prior to Sinai because it's about what happened there, so it comes about ahead of time. There's a precursor to the Sabbath within the Passover commands there, or within commands about manna and stuff that still comes ahead of time before you get to Exodus 20 and the actual laws. But to try to keep this a bit organized, I want to start by saying I am for God's law. Secondly, to give you just a little bit of perspective on where I'm at, I believe, and I think that I can show from Scripture, and that I have shown from Scripture in writing, that there are real distinctions within God's law, or I should say within the law of Moses, that there are distinctions between different types of laws, even though there's not a single spot that goes ahead and gives you a list of here's your moral law that's always applicable, and here's your ceremonial law that's just temporary. That's not how God reveals these distinctions, by giving us a list, but that's an artificial requirement to place on Scripture to say that if it's not in that form, then it's not biblical. There are definitely, as we think about the traditional Protestant understanding of the law is the threefold understanding that you have, or some may call it tripartite or something. You've just got these three different types of laws in there. Now they're all intertwined, but you don't tell them apart because of what section they're in, or because of a chapter heading. That's a modern invention of how to communicate things. The way you tell them apart is really just through meditation on them and seeing the distinctions found when Scripture talks about specific laws. And there's going to be a tiny bit of overlap, but as we'll see, the distinctions become really plain. And I'm not, obviously, I can't get into every specific text. I'm driving right now. But just to give you an idea, what are the three types of law? So you have moral law, ceremonial or ritual law, and then the third type is the civil law. And these are given different types, judicial, sometimes how civil is described. There's different types of laws. So now different theologians are going to kind of think, there may not be 100% unanimity on what falls within each category. Some may say, for example, that the law that says if you find mold in your house that you haven't examined, and then if the mold grows, then you have that area of the house destroyed, and taken apart, built fresh, and things like that. That those are ritualistic or ceremonial, and I would say kind of. They definitely have to do with cleanliness, which does have a ritual, sort of cleanliness, aspect to it. But there are also civil laws, because the way that I'm defining civil law is really the way Scripture talks about an if-then sort of law. It's not a law like thou shalt not murder, which just says, hey, here's something you're not supposed to do, or, remember the Sabbath, here's something you are supposed to do. Rather, it's something like, if someone is guilty of kidnapping, then they are to be put to death. If someone steals something, then they are to be retribution to the one they stole from, that kind of stuff. So, if then. And the if-then stuff, there's people who have studied this a lot deeper than I have and talk about the fact that the law of Israel really looks like a sort of case law as opposed to statutory law like we have in America, where the letter of the law, what is written down, is what you go to or at case law and stuff like that. And that's why you have the stories in the Torah are really meant to help illustrate laws and sort of the spirit of the law, what we might call that today. But the really simple point I want to make is that in the Torah you have laws that of these three types. You have laws that are clearly civil. Like there's no, and as I'm defining civil, I mean if then. If this happens, then you do this. This is how you deal with, violations of this law, basically. And some of the violations aren't really even violations in terms of sin. Some of them just have to do with cleanliness. As I said, so a woman is on her period, she's unclean, she's ceremonially unclean. If she's on her period, then she is unclean. And if she sits on something, then that piece of furniture becomes unclean, that kind of thing. There you see sort of the if-then, and it's how we handle ceremonial uncleanness. So it's not always an issue of sin, of someone, if someone sins. It's just if someone is in a certain state regarding the law, and that might be sin, that might just be unclean, being unclean or any number of things. But if that happens, here's what you do, and here's how you handle it. That is civil law. And there's really no way to dispute that some of the laws in the Torah are like that, and some of the laws are not like that. So, and civil law will relate to, what we'll discuss here as far as moral and ceremonial law. It'll relate to both. And so whether civil law, and this, what I believe, and this is what people who generally describe themselves as theonomists, this I agree with, that they say is that if a civil law relates to a moral law, then the civil penalty for violating that moral law is also a moral law, and but that if the civil law relates to a ceremonial law, then that civil law also is a ceremonial law in the sense that it is related to how to handle ceremonial issues, religious issues. And some of those are severe and some are not. So, a man picking up sticks on the Sabbath was stoned. A person who is unclean because they touched a dead body is just unclean, needs to wash themselves, that kind of stuff. So, you've got, obviously it varies, but it's, but that's kind of how civil law can be, related to the other two laws, other two types of law as well. So how do you tell, and this is the big thing when it comes to Hebrews, is how do you tell the difference between moral law and ceremonial law? The Hebrews person or Torah sort of person would say there's no difference, it's all moral law. Stop trying to make a distinction where there isn't. But what we see when we look at the places where something we can find related to all the ceremonial laws, and by that I mean the big things like Sabbath, feast days, kosher dietary laws, those are kind of the big ones, but even the little ones like, the tying the tzitzit, the tassels, cutting the edges of your beard, these types of smaller items, is that related to those and given as a justification for those. Maybe not every time in the law that those are mentioned, but at least at some point, when every one of those is mentioned, you have a justification that is related in some sense to the fact that Yahweh is the God of Israel and not of the nations, and this law is making a distinction between Israel and the nations. Or, it's because God, led them out of Egypt, and that's why they have this law. Or it can, for a perfect example is the second time the Sabbath law is given, when the Ten Commandments are given in Deuteronomy, it gives a different justification. The first time in Exodus, it's about creation. For God, created the earth in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. But in Deuteronomy, it's a different justification. It says, because, and don't make your slaves work on the Sabbath, either because you were slaves in Egypt, and I brought you freedom. So you should also, on the Sabbath when you rest, so should your manservant, your maidservant, that kind of thing. So there's a justification given related there to the Sabbath that is specific to Israel in a way that it isn't true of the other nations. I mean, God didn't bring all the other nations out of Egypt. God only did that for Israel. And if the justification for a law that God gives is somehow related, it's, another term that gets used about these laws is that they're redemptive, that they're based on the redemptive story that God is telling both through the laws and through history itself. You have these laws that are meant to reflect that, and so all of what's typically understood to be ceremonial laws, they all at some point have this kind of justification. And no, it's not always in the same exact language, but it's always there at some point. And I want to address one thing that someone might say, at this point, is that, well, there's passages in Leviticus, I can think of one, where it just gives a sort of list of sundry laws. It has some that are generally understood to be ceremonial, some that are not, that are definitely understood to be, regular moral laws, and then at the end they're all justified the same way. This, I am Yahweh your God, and that kind of thing. Well, sure, and that's the thing is that the justifications aren't necessarily, it's not that God justifies all of these laws, these ceremonial laws, through this redemptive story way, and never justifies any other laws that we would consider moral in that way. But what we see is that the laws, we see another ingredient that helps us kind of get to this, is that a lot of these other laws that we would consider moral, you don't just find them in the giving of the Torah in Exodus and Exodus and Leviticus, these passages that we understood to come from Sinai, or in Deuteronomy where they're going into the land and a bunch of laws are given. We find them illustrated prior to, we find them in Genesis, and we find, and again, not all of them, but we see a lot of these examples too. So when we take everything together as a whole, we can see the distinctions there, right there within the text. And that is, one way that I see that there are laws that are definitely eternal, that they've always been true. They're true by nature of creation, that God created us a certain way and therefore expects us to behave a certain way in light of that. And then there are the laws given through Moses that, some of which are, reflective of that eternal law, but some of which are intended just for Israel, for this physical, visible picture that distinguishes Israel from the other nations. So I will get to more of that next time I do one of these.